pleasure to be here and to see so many people that I've known for years and respected and worked with, including people that have worked on some of the research projects that I'm going to speak about today. What I'd like to do is use my own personal experience in what I'd call community-based research as a launching point to talk about some of the themes that Elizabeth was mentioning for the conference. So what I'm going to do is give you an overview of some research that I actually started when I realized I was interested in geriatrics, which was when I began to learn that what I had been taught just didn't apply to the patients that I was seeing, and give you a sense of how that initial experience has evolved into a research career, which I think is as interdisciplinary as you can imagine. And then as a way of pulling it all together, leave you with what are my sort of themes and insights as a result of what are probably about 30 years now of research in aging and dementia, but what I would call interdisciplinary research. And as a sort of rejoinder to that, I really got the bug for interdisciplinary research from the Clinical Scholars Program, which in those days was designed for physicians who wanted to learn the non-biologic issues affecting health. So if you think about that for a minute, you're already into interdisciplinary thinking from that point. And then going forward, I think the other person that influenced me a lot was David Sackett, who gave many interesting presentations over the years, but one of which was describing programmatic research, where you research in a program area, but you bring together people from many different disciplines. And I hope to illustrate that in this presentation. So our work started really in 1978, when we started a geriatrics and family services clinic at the university, and Burton Reifler and I and a social worker started seeing older patients with suspected dementia. And I realized that as I saw my first 10 or so patients, that everything I'd learned in medical school and residency, and I'd just been a chief resident, so I thought I knew everything, was not what I was seeing. And we went to the literature and read the paper of the month. The flavor of the month was what's called Dementia in the Elderly, Annals of Internal Medicine. Very good paper, good people writing it. And the database that was used for that paper were papers published describing dementia in persons under the age of 60. So immediately you begin to think, dementia in the elderly? What's the evidence base? So we basically designed a sheet of paper, front and back side, which we prospectively collected data in an unfunded research study and began to do descriptive research in that population. And I've listed a few of the papers. I think many of you are probably familiar with these, but the point of these papers is they were some of the most influential papers of the time, and all of them were done without any external funding. And it was because we were an interdisciplinary group. I was an internist, Burton was a psychiatrist, we had a psychologist and a social worker, and we also went into some of the other social science disciplines in developing our papers on the outcome of the dementia workup, which contradicted the paper I just mentioned in terms of the distribution of outcomes. We described coexistence of depression and dementia. Before that, it was felt that they were one or the other, not coexisting, and we described the very high rate of depression in caregivers, which had not been appreciated, and very simple observations that we were able to make. And the lessons that we learned at this stage was that in a new field, remember I just said, the papers that were in the literature then were not even describing the field we were in. They were not geriatric-based papers. You can do an awful lot of things with unfunded research, and you can make very valuable contributions. It's fun. It's a lot easier to collect data for 2 years, write a paper, get it published, then write a grant, write it again, write it again, and eventually get funded, and 5 to 7 years later you might have a paper from that grant. They're typically important because they haven't been made before, and if you make them carefully, they're enduring observations. And it is a springboard for funded research. You quickly realize doing unfunded research that you don't want to do it forever. You know you need to do funded research to make any kind of headway in a field. So that was the start for us. And you ought to ask yourself, what is the new field in geriatrics today? And I don't know what you think it is, but I think one of the new fields in geriatrics is going to be the old. In my clinic this morning, a third of the patients that I saw were over the age of 90. And if you go to the literature and you try to read something about those patients, you don't have a lot of data to use. And we don't really even know what people want out of life in a very systematic way over the age of 90. You talk to your patients and you learn a great deal, but it's new. It's definitely new. So there is a new field out there, and there always will be new fields in medical research. So then we went on to phase 2, and this is, we actually, is anybody here from the National Institute on Aging or NIMH? We actually did our first grant on the research we'd already done. So we wrote a grant. It was the very first grant I wrote. I was totally inexperienced, and we wrote our first grant, and it was basically the study we had done with those self-maintained cards, databases, and essentially redid the study. But this time we did it systematically, and the beautiful thing about funding is it allowed us to do follow-up. And in geriatric research, I really don't think cross-sectional studies have much value. It's really important in geriatric research to do follow-up. So, and if you think about it, unfunded research it's really almost impossible to do systematic follow-up. So that was the main value of getting funded. But again, we produced a series of papers that I think have made a difference. And the lesson that I'd like to leave you with there is that we had a research nurse on our team. And it's a very interesting story. Her name is Connie Canfield. She started to work for me. I'd never written a grant before. And so she came to me one day, and she's first day on the job, she said, "Where's my office?" This is the University of Washington. Bill Hazard knows that there are no offices to be had. And of course, I realized that I hadn't done all my planning at the time. So one of the things about interdisciplinary research is you're going to work with many disciplines, but you also need a mentor to help you with some of these details that are easy to forget in the start of a research project. But anyway, Burton found an office for Connie up on the psychiatry office floor, and we were off and running. And we've been pretty much continuously funded ever since then to do research. And the research we did there was in a dementia clinic. And we thought we were doing pretty well because we were seeing community-based persons who had come to us for their evaluation, and we were able to, and I'll show you some of the observations, but I began to realize during that time that there's something very different about patients who come to a university referral clinic. You can still make very good observations, but it's not quite the same as where I am today. So we looked at adverse drug reactions. We showed the frequency of falls and fractures and dementia and their interrelation, and how the observation that Connie made was people would fall, they'd break their hip, and she'd say, they're not available for the annual follow-up. What's going on here? And David Buckner, who was then a clinical scholar and junior faculty, began to work on falls and fractures. Richard Ullman, another junior faculty, worked on the contribution that hearing loss and visual loss does to the severity of dementia and the onset of dementia, and we looked at mortality rates and health services utilization. I think the most important paper that came out of that series was the paper on adverse drug reactions that appeared in the Annals many years ago. But the reason I show you this today is because this was the exact opposite of the paper on dementia in the elderly that I referred to, which was on young people, and showed that the most common reversible cause of dementia was adverse drug reaction. And the drugs being used then were benzos and antihypertensives and anticholinergic. And now that we're doing population-based research, and now that I see the community from very different angles, this research, I think, has, along with a lot of education, has made a difference. I do not think we see nearly as many cases, or the density of adverse drug reactions causing cognitive impairment is much lower in our community anyway. And so these research projects can make a difference that you can appreciate 20 or so years after they're published. The other thing we began to do was do more health services research, and this is the work that Wayne McCormick did as a health services researcher with people in the School of Public Health. And we began to look at the issue of, are dementia patients or Alzheimer's disease patients sicker? Do they use more healthcare resources than persons of the same age without Alzheimer's disease? And what we showed, or what Wayne showed, we showed this now in several studies, and it's hard for people to believe, is that Alzheimer's disease patients do not require more resources in acute and ongoing care than other people of their age. What they do require is a lot of long-term care, and they're 10 times greater than the reference population. And this is an observation that is held up, and it was not a very popular observation because people wanted a higher premium for having a high density of Alzheimer's patients. And I think that persons with Alzheimer's disease are a challenge, but I do not think they're any more challenging than other geriatric patients. But this was our foray into health services. Well, I told you that at some point I decided, I'm not sure that we can sustain this as a research base. The Geriatrics and Family Services Clinic became what's called Core C of the University of Washington's Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. And I began to realize that it's very hard to generalize from this population to the general population, which is my passion, is research that works for the general population. And we had the opportunity with Bud Kukul to develop an incident case finding study in the Group Health Cooperative in response to a RFA from NIA to say, how do you build a registry of Alzheimer's disease similar to a cancer registry? Can you build that as a research base? And if so, how would you do it? And we've taken that, and it's been our continuous source of funding in a U01 since 1986, and thanks to the National Institute on Aging. And this is, again, an example of what I hope you'll believe is interdisciplinary research, where we formed a collaborative agreement with a few people at the Center for Health Studies at Group Health and a couple of clinicians who saw older patients there, and figured out a way to find all the new cases of Alzheimer's disease and other dementias in the co-op. The idea was that we would use them for a whole host of analytic studies, some of our own and some studies that other people were interested in doing. We developed a database of medical, psychological, and epidemiologic data. We followed people annually and did work on survival. And eventually, we developed a collaboration with the neuropathologic group. I'll say a little bit more about that later. But all this we tried to put together. We put it together, I'd say, with variable degrees of success. And one of the points that I learned early on in interdisciplinary research is that you're going to work with people who are all-stars. And you're also going to work with people who are just there, you know. And you'll see, to put together a full, interdisciplinary team, if you want all the disciplines involved, you may not be able to be as selective as you'd like to be, even at a great university like the University of Washington. And that's going to change with the people who are available to work with you on your teams. But you can put all this sort of together in a registry. And we felt that the best way to do this was to do it in a primary care setting rather than in a referral setting. And what we were able to show in a couple of papers is that if you study patients and populations in this setting, you get very different results. So in the population base that we developed in the ADRC, Ross Barnett and Debbie Swang have shown that It's less familial. Patients are older. The frequency with which they have the ApoE4 allele is less. And it actually, there are a number of other variables that show a population taken from a primary care setting, from a known population base, is much more representative than what you get from the ADRC and from the clinic that we were using before. And this is exactly what we accomplished here. Another nice thing about group health for doing this kind of research is that in this population, the annual attrition rate is less than 1%. We had 22,000 people over the age of 60, and we know that they're demographically similar to the surrounding population. And this was in 1986 or 87. Now, 20 years later, we now know, and we're writing a proposal this week, that the subjects we have in our research that I'm going to talk about a little bit later have a mode of 40 years of medical records between when they came to group health and today. So we've got this fabulous demographically similar population with data going back into relatively early phases of their lives, all of which is on a medical record. It's a paper record in the early years, but now it's an electronic record. We also formed a case control series that Bud led, and that allowed us to find controls, and it also allowed us to gather samples and develop a biorepository. And one of the things that I think is going to be very important in geriatric research in the future is the use of biorepositories. Having DNA, maybe some proteins, and other markers that you can draw on to do research. And this was the start for us of being able to do that. And that brought us into the genetic laboratory of Jerry Schellenberg, who's been a collaborator ever since because of our focus on molecular genetics back in about 1989 or so is when we started doing that. The interesting thing about our research at the beginning was we basically found ourselves writing papers refuting other people's papers. Does anybody remember platelet membrane fluidity? Yeah, there are some people that have been around for a while. I mean, we thought that was going to be the marker for Alzheimer's disease as a result of a paper published in Science, featured in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and we couldn't duplicate it. And there were a number of studies like that where when you go from a highly selected referral population with a very precise assay, maybe that's somebody's pet assay, you might find an association, and it goes away when you go into a more genuine population. And of all those studies, the last one, their ApoE, was the enduring one, and now 20 years later, of course, we know ApoE is the marker for late life Alzheimer's disease, not the only marker. It doesn't explain all the genetic input on late life Alzheimer's, but it is a valid one. We also began to work on risk factor studies, looking at solvents, head trauma, and depression, and really some of that was new, some of that was old, but if you think about the risk factors that I've listed there, they're not very helpful, are they, for public health? We want to prevent depression anyway, not to prevent Alzheimer's disease because depression is miserable. Nobody wants head trauma to be prevalent in our society, but those early risk factor studies and organic solvents are neurotoxins, so that seems to be pretty obvious. But so those early studies that we were doing, they were interdisciplinary, but as far as benefit for patients and public health, not quite a lot. But when we begin to study the patterns of care, I think then we begin to see things that would be quite useful for clinicians and quite useful for patients. And we begin to do some intervention studies. And that's when I think the momentum for really valuable research started, was when we were able to have enough experience and enough of a team that we could mount some intervention studies. So this is an example of a symptom pattern, another one of Wayne's studies. But I thought this was a very interesting study because he looked at cases and controls, the cases from the ADPR, the controls from the genetic differences, and compared their symptoms in the 2 years before we found them as incident cases. And what he showed was people do report symptoms of cognitive impairment before they're diagnosed. It's not a silent epidemic if you're attuned to it. And today that doesn't seem like a very novel observation, but it was, I think, then. And also depression, weight loss, and hypersomnia. But common symptoms that everybody should be reporting were much less reported in the cases. And it describes the fact that you really can't take care of Alzheimer's disease patients without good information. And you will not necessarily get good information from the informant because the informant, from the patient, because the disease is loss of memory. So the model of care that derives from these data would be that people underreport common symptoms. When you see a patient with dementia, in my own practice, I always say, don't come alone, come with somebody so we can have another source of information. And this is another one that early in my career, I was very interested in the use of neuroimaging, and I always wondered why we were doing rule-outs for the dementia workup. And this is a study done by Elizabeth Alexander, who was a physician who took some time out to get a degree at Group Health, and we looked at, do surgical lesions present as isolated dementia, going back to that original paper where in non-elderly persons, the most common reversible cause of dementia were surgical lesions, neural pressure hydrocephalus, subdural hematoma, and intracranial tumors. And so she looked at how often does this happen in a real population? And what she showed was that over the 5 or so years, 137,000 person years, we have incident rates for subdural hematoma, 46 per 100,000, hydrocephalus, 5.8 per 100,000, other tumors, 53 per 100,000. These are very low rates. And of those, only 59 presented with cognitive impairment. And of those, very few of them had isolated cognitive impairment. So this notion that we should be doing neuroimaging to find these things in older people doesn't hold up as a reasonable strategy when you look in an actual population. Now, you may do these imaging tests for other reasons nowadays, and functional magnetic resonance imaging is a great tool for research in Alzheimer's disease, but it doesn't have that much value for a clinical. So that was phase 3, case control studies, finding cases. In phase 4, we began to look around and say, where is all the great chronic disease work being done in the world? And in fact, the example of that is the Framingham study. And the Framingham study has been around for a while and is a fabulous source of information on both the natural history and the risk factors for progression and onset of coronary heart disease. And so we decided we're going to try to do an Inception Cohort and convert our study from a case control to a study in which we put in 2,600 people over the age of 65 who we knew were not demented, and then we followed them forward. We've since taken that and added another 850 patients in 2000 to 2002 because when you're in aging, your cohorts go away much faster than you'd like, but they don't stay alive as long as when you start a birth cohort, for example. And what we now have is a replacement strategy where we keep our cohort of non-demented persons right around 2,000 persons. So it's a laboratory for aging research. We're funded to do dementia and Alzheimer's disease research because of very unique specific aims, but engrafted onto that now is a neuropathologic laboratory study. We just got a grant to do a genome-wide analysis study, linking it to the electronic medical records, some neuroimaging, and you can bring together people from many disciplines into this, what we call laboratory to study aging, and very interesting. The work that we've done is described on this slide, prevalence and incidence, done a lot of interesting things looking at racial and ethnic differences and education effects on dementia. We basically are working on the brain reserve hypothesis, and so far that hypothesis has been a good way to frame our research in terms of risk and a course of Alzheimer's disease, and that's where we're we're standing right now. I'm going to present a few pieces of data which some of you are familiar with, but to emphasize a couple points that I want to make about interdisciplinary research and opportunities. This is the first study, to my knowledge, it's from the CAME project in Seattle, to show incident rates or prevalence rates other than 65 to 75, 75 to 85, 85 and older. And take a look at these numbers. Do you know that the rate of cognitive impairment and dementia is almost 75% above the age of 95? Now, I didn't know that until we saw these numbers, but I believe that's not very far off. And part of the reason I believe it's not very far off is because we made the observations ourselves, and I've got an ego involved, but also because I'm going to show you some curves. But the point of this is when you go into the population, you can actually find these numbers out. If you don't, I think you're going to have a hard time, because 95-year-old people do not come to dementia clinics. They're not going to make it to the university very often. You have to go out into the field to find these people. And this is the reason I think these numbers are accurate, is because our curve is in the midst of about 8 here. This is a table that Amy Bornstein developed for this paper, but you can see we now know the prevalence rates of dementia in percents. Those curves are from studies from the United States and Europe primarily, and they parallel each other. And you can see the real population that gets dementia is somewhere starting around the age of 75, and then it goes dramatically up as we get into the older age ranges. And these are our incidence figures. They don't show up real well, but the point about this slide is this is a log scale on the y-axis here. So you see these curves coursing upwards, but you go from a rate of less than 1 per thousand or 2 or 3 per thousand at between 65 and 70, and when you get up into the 90 to 95 age groups, you're looking at incident rates of 30 to 50 per thousand. So a very steep increase, somewhere around 80, 85, where the curves really start to go up. And so for clinicians to know the pretest probability that they're going to see a lot of this in their practice, and they're going to see it developing in patients who they've seen for years, is I think a very useful piece of information. Most importantly, though, I think once we got into the case control registry work and into the cohort study, we were able to do some intervention studies. And this is the study that Linda Terry's group put together, and we begin to see that you can really make a big difference in the course of Alzheimer's disease. This was the walking study that appeared in JAMA a few years ago, basically showing that if you have a caregiver who can take a person with Alzheimer's disease and walk with them at least once a week, you reduce the rate of physical decline, and you see a lower rate at which people are sent to nursing homes for behavioral problems. So very simple intervention had a major effect on the course of the illness in this population. And Linda and her team are in the nursing school, and it's again an example of interdisciplinary research. In the future, and this is where I'm starting to go into my sort of insights and observations, I think where we need to work is, in Alzheimer's disease anyway, to do more of these cohort-based randomized trials. And my belief is that the chronic care model has been shown to work for some chronic diseases. It's not been worked out very well for dementia, but I think it should be developed and tested. Sue McCurry is working on a randomized trial of a sleep hygiene program, which the trial is going very well, but it's basically designing interventions to deal with the troublesome features of Alzheimer's disease, or some of the troublesome features that you see in people who are getting older. And the big plea that I would like to make today is we really need to study mild cognitive impairment, or MCI. we started a study of MCI in our population, and it's called MCI Epi. So we're looking at the epidemiology of mild cognitive impairment in a population. We estimated, based on the literature, that out of 100 people, 20 or 25 might screen positive using the research criteria that were published. We're finding that 60 to 70% are screening positive in our population. So how can that really work in a community population for a condition we think is going to lead to Alzheimer's disease in a fairly high percentage of the people? The rates aren't that high even. So again, a lot of these things that are discovered in referral populations really need to be studied and understood in community populations. And again, it's just like that sort of rate above 90 or 95, or distribution of dementia causes over the age of 65. You make very new and novel observations when you make them in a community, a population. So what have we learned? In our study, there are a number of things that I think are interesting. One is how simple the observations can be. It doesn't take much to observe the causes of cognitive impairment and the course, but if it's new observation, if it's in a population that's representative, the results are going to be valuable and are going to be enduring. Many of the findings in referral populations are simply not reproducible. Many of them are, but you don't know at the end of the day until you've looked. It goes without saying to this group that Alzheimer's disease, dementia, cognitive impairment, it is the common source of disability along with osteoarthritis in an older population, especially over the age of 80. In the future, what I think we're going to be doing is continue with the Inception-based cohort study, but we're going to be going into the biobanking business and whole genome analysis data and correlating the genome arrays with all the phenotype data that we've collected to try to get at the gene environment relationships that you see in all of the age-related phenomena, especially cognitive impairment and cognitive decline, and probably also just functional impairment. I think eventually we're going to see large representative national samples. The NIH is moving us in the direction of banking our data so it's available elsewhere. The HMO Research Network, which we're part of at Group Health, contains somewhere between 15 and 20 million lives scattered around the country, highly diverse population, and a wonderful laboratory for aging, because again, there's not a lot of movement in and out of Medicare plans this day. Randomized trials of treatments I've mentioned. Our research is in the area of modifiable risk and protective factors, and I think we are beginning to discover lifestyle factors that contribute to the risk of Alzheimer's disease and dementia that could be very practical for public health strategies. And the last bullet is, someday I think we're going to actually be doing a multi-factorial risk factor intervention trial, similar to Mr. Fit for heart disease in the elderly, looking at functional or cognitive impairment as an outcome. So what are the themes? I think the first thing you want to think about, and I'm taking this from David Sackett, what he taught me by watching what he did at McMaster's with their research group up in Ontario, Canada. You want to have clinicians of very different backgrounds. And by that I mean in medical specialties, but also in other clinical areas like nursing and social work and nutrition. In aging especially, the phenomenology is so diverse that you're really going to be at a disadvantage if you only have people from your own tribe. And in academics, we're very tribal. So you have to work consciously to get beyond that notion of, I just want to be with geriatricians, if you're a medical geriatrician, or I just want to be with nephrologists if I want to study kidney function in old age. You want to have multidisciplinary groups in terms of their backgrounds, and nursing is an extremely important group to have in your research group, because nursing is all about aging. The word nursing home, it's not called a doctor's home or an aging home. It's called a nursing home because that's what nurses do, and they do it well. Second point is you need strong methodologists. The analyses that we do in our studies, and I've got a master's degree in public health, and I thought I knew a lot of statistics, but it's all above my head now. And I have to trust that I have very strong methodologists in statistics and epidemiology in particular, but also in genetics nowadays. And no person can master all those disciplines, or at least if you master them, the only way you can keep mastery is to stay on the leading edge. So build a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary group around some strong methodologists. Social scientists and health services researchers, I think, are extremely important because so much of what happens in aging research is about community and public health and the system in which people get care. And then lastly, if you're putting together a team, and Lisa can speak to that, she knows our team very well, Shelley knows it, we're blessed because the research team that I work with, Meredith Van Schmidt, started in 1986. And even though she went off to Nepal for a little while, she's still working with us. And many of the people that work on our team have worked together for 10 or more years. And I think that happens, to some of it it's just dumb luck, but some of it is also working hard on team building as a leader or as a member of a team to make sure that that team doesn't go off in what I would call self-destructive ways, which can happen. Funding is important. You can do small projects without much funding, but I think in today's academic environment, nobody has a lot of time to volunteer for research. In my early career, I studied acute mountain sickness and got people to race up Mount Rainier on acetazolamide and placebo, and all of that was volunteer, and we published papers on that. I don't see a lot of that happening today because the sort of productivity expectations of faculty don't allow for a lot of side research, but it's really fun to do that kind of research because people that do it want to do it, or they wouldn't be doing it, not just doing it for money. The best funding in aging research right now is obviously the National Institute on Aging, but I think that with the roadmap, and you should go to the website of the NIH roadmap and take a look, you'll be amazed at how much is there. But that and the CTSAs, which are now the coming way, that CRCs are being organized and training programs in all academic medical centers, that's where the action is going to be. And I can't imagine that aging research, interdisciplinary aging research, is not going to be a major part of that. So we'll have the NIA as a basis for aging funding, and also the NCRR, the National Center for Research Resources of the NIH, as a very important area. Creative ideas. NIH research funding, and this is a pearl from Steve Schroeder, is all about rigor. To get an NIH grant funded, it's got to be so rigorous that you can convince somebody that your specific aims are going to be met by your methods. Many of the more relevant problems are not as accessible to very rigorous research methods. And it's often the foundations which are willing to take a bit more of a chance on a novel idea than I think NIH is. And the way we've been able to get our novel ideas funded, or not funded, but worked on, has been as add-ons, where you make an observation in your group, sitting around a table, talking about patients or talking about research results, and you say, well, we could study that, and we could add that on to an existing grant. And lastly, and I think Seth mentioned this in his presentation, career development awards are critical to our field. The Beeson Awards and the other K Awards that are out there are absolutely essential. They're good for the individuals that get them, and they're a way to grow research teams. In terms of mission, I want to say a few words about that. Leadership is really critical in interdisciplinary research. You can't bring disciplines together unless you pay attention to the job of leadership. And my belief is that the job of leadership does not just work if you're just talking about grants and papers as the metric. You've got to talk about what's the greater good of what we're doing. Why are we doing this in the first place? Group health motto is to transform healthcare. And our motto at the center is to use research to transform healthcare. And I think for interdisciplinary groups to really function on all 6 cylinders, there has to be a greater good to their mission. It's not just about how many grants can we get and how many papers can we publish. So think about that and ask yourselves as you do your work and your careers, what is the greater good in terms of what I'm doing? Listen to public voices. We learned so much just because we're out talking to patients, we're out listening to public groups, talking, there were 2 men who founded the Alzheimer's Association here in Seattle, which led to the National Alzheimer's Association. Burton listened to those guys, and I listened to them, and we encouraged them, and we got good research ideas. We found out about depression in caregivers because of those 2 gentlemen who were so depressed about their wives getting Alzheimer's disease, and then they went off and did some fabulous things with their lives. Try to match clinical observations to funding opportunities. What I mean there is the observations we make in day-to-day practice or caring for patients are often the ones that lead to the best research. And the challenge is how do you keep those on point? I'm very interested in the concept of bidirectional research. And the idea there is that as scientists, we think about the next question, and as that next question turns into a result, moving that result into the field for patient benefit. We also have to think about what the field wants. When we were putting together the University of Washington CTSA, we went to the tribes in the Pacific Northwest and said, we'd like to help you by translating our research into practice. And here's all the things we can do for you. We're very interested in diabetes. Diabetes is a big problem in the tribes. And they said to us, fine, but if you're going to do anything, work on meth. I hadn't even thought about methamphetamine in tribes at that time. This was a couple of years ago. And so our research has to be bidirectional. We have to listen to our patients, but we also have to listen to the public that represents especially diverse groups that are suffering from health disparities, because we may not know about that in our universities. Give back to participants. Create homes in your research. One of the things that we've learned in the longitudinal studies is people get tired of being research subjects. And there are many saints out there in the world, but we've got to have something that we give back to them along the way. And I learned this with the Japanese community here in Seattle, Japanese American community, and I'm learning it more as people are now in 10, 12, 14 years in our studies. And we do things like birthday cards, but we also send out a quarterly newsletter. We try to let people know about advanced findings, and anything we can give back to our participants, I think is very, very important, and to help them feel like they're part of a home, that they're like a family member, extended family, by being in a research project. And again, I've said it over and over again, but if you can, strive to do your research in a community base using population-based settings. Thank you.